Hello and welcome to Infocus. I'm G. Sampath. It's been a month since Canada held its general elections, and the people have voted in a liberal government for the fourth consecutive time. The voters have reposed their faith in Mark Carney, a former central banker with no political experience. He has never held a political office until the start of this year. And everyone seems to agree that the Trump factor played a key role in the outcome of this election. So, what are the challenges for the new Canadian Prime Minister? And with the two main parties, the Liberals and the Conservatives, accounting for 85% of the vote share, and the smaller parties decimated in these elections, is Canada moving towards a two party system? And with the cabinet reshuffle after the elections, we now have an Indian origin foreign minister in Anita Anand. So, what are the implications of this development for Indo Canadian ties, which have not been in great shape in recent times? To discuss all these questions, we have with us Sanjay Ruparelia, who holds the Jarislowsky Democracy Chair and is professor in the Department of Politics and Public Administration at Toronto Metropolitan University. Sanjay, welcome to the pod.
Thanks for having me back.
Sanjay, to start with, I wanted your thoughts on Mark Carney. He's a complete newbie to politics, and he replaced Justin Trudeau fairly recently. And subsequently, he led the Liberals to their fourth consecutive victory against all the odds, given that in December they were behind the Conservatives by as much as 20 percentage points. So can you tell us something about Carney's background? Where did he suddenly emerge from, and what makes him tick?
That's a good question. So he is trained as an economist, did his DPhil at Oxford, went into private banking, Goldman Sachs for many years, worked, I believe, in New York and Tokyo, and perhaps even London. But he then joined public service in Canada. I think there were always ambitions to work in government and actually to enter politics, according to friends and colleagues. Um, so he became the governor of the Bank of Canada and stewarded the economy quite well at the time, particularly on the monetary side during the great financial crash in 2008. And it was actually his handling of that in Canada that caught the attention of David Cameron, who was then Prime Minister in Britain. And then the unusual move of asking a Canadian to be the governor of the Bank of England. And he held that position through Brexit. Opinion opinion in Britain, from what I've read, has been divided. One, that he was a very steady hand at the tiller during this very volatile moment in the British economy. Critics would say that he sort of came out opposed to Brexit, or saying highlighting the drawbacks, economic impact that would be negative from Brexit. So he was criticized for that. But he was basically seen as as an extremely competent, experienced, steady hand, particularly in crises. That became his calling card, and certainly how he also projects himself politically. Um, and then after that, he became a senior advisor to the Secretary General of the United Nations on climate finance, in particular. So those are his credentials. I mean, he's a technocrat. He's a globalist. He belongs to the world of Davos. He has an incredible Rolodex of the most powerful people, certainly in the Western world. In terms of his political ambitions, you're absolutely right. He's never held political office, so it's quite extraordinary that he runs for office and he becomes a prime minister of Canada, a G7 country. But his political ambitions, from all reports, were there from for a very long time, and probably going back to maybe even when he was a student or soon after in his career. But as far back as 2012, there were reports that he was being recruited by the Liberal Party to potentially run for the leadership. The former Conservative government, led by Stephen Harper, reports were that he offered him to become Prime Finance Minister in a Conservative government, which he declined. And then even after Justin Trudeau became Prime Minister from 2015 until he resigned, there were numerous points at which there was speculation or reports that Justin Trudeau was trying to recruit him into his government, most likely to be the finance minister. And in fact, it was that particular overture which led to the downfall of Trudeau eventually, where suggestions were made that uh, Trudeau had offered Carney the finance ministership just a year ago, informed the then finance minister. Um, Sorry, I'm suddenly blanking. Um,
So it's interesting that you mentioned that he's from Goldman Sachs. I mean, and there are a lot of Goldman Sachs people getting into office lately. I think not just in Canada. I think your Natural Resources Minister Tim Hodgson, he's also from Goldman Sachs. Someone from Goldman Sachs in charge of Canada's natural resources is very interesting. I think even Emmanuel Macron, I think is, if I'm not mistaken, was with Goldman Sachs or one of those Goldman Sachs kind of firms. I mean, I find it really interesting. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
yeah, no, I suddenly blanked. It was Friday morning. Chrysler Freeland was the finance minister,
Right,
and
right.
was seen to be in quite a humiliating way asked to move aside for Carney, and that precipitated her resignation, which brought down the Trudeau government. And so, he enters politics, and extraordinary. We'll probably get to that later in the conversation, why he was such an effective leader for the Liberals in this win. On the question of Goldman Sachs, it's a good question. I think, um, I mean, my experience has actually been more in the United States, for 20 years where I lived in New York. And what was striking there is how many Goldman Sachs CEOs or chief financial officers would often serve in very high positions in the US government, either as a Treasury Secretary or the Council of Economic Advisors and so on. Going back to at least Robert Rubin in the Clinton administration, for instance. And I think so my sense is the connection between Goldman and the upper echelons of U.S. politics is well known and quite strong. But it's an intriguing question. It's certainly a very powerful bank, and it's certainly in the neoliberal era. In many North Atlantic democracies, it would be an interesting question to see just how many senior economic portfolios in government were held by former Goldman Sachs officials.
Yeah. Also, when you sort of put this beside the fact that Carney is someone who's been wooed by the conservatives as well as the liberals.
That's right.
Right. Right.
Yes, I mean, and so to probably jump ahead to a future question, one of the things that's very striking about what he campaigned on, and in fact what roiled a lot of the Conservative Party in Canada, particularly its leader Pierre Poilievre, is he seemed to have stolen many of their ideas, borrowed them, taken them. As centrist parties can often do, they can tilt left or right depending on which way they think the political winds are blowing. So lowering taxes, reducing regulation, focusing on economic growth and enhancing productivity. All of these things were what the Conservatives have been campaigning on against Trudeau for quite some time. And Carney definitely, even in the cast of liberal politicians, I mean, again, he's just become a politician, but let's say liberal figures, definitely the Liberal Party in Canada has sort of a left wing and a so-called right wing, depending on its phase and its history, the leaders, and so on. Carney definitely looks, cut from a cloth of a center-right liberal politician, and the focus on the economy, on growth, on banking, on finance, and so on. He's also written a book on the importance of
So
tech
he is to
employment.
the right of Trudeau.
Yes, I mean, I think it depends on what issues we're looking at. I mean, he's certainly much more focused on questions of the economy, business, commerce, trade. He describes himself as a pragmatist. Trudeau was seen as very much someone who was focused more on questions of social justice, indigenous reconciliation, multiculturalism, those kinds of questions. Uh, his supporters saw him as very progressive on many of those things, but then also hypocritical. For instance, on the question of gender files, he was sort of seen as Canada's first so-called feminist prime minister, but then women cabinet ministers also were summarily dismissed in several instances by him, and so that was seen as a sign of his lack of credibility on that issue. He was to critics seen as more performative rather than substantial, and so the contrast between him and Carney is quite striking, both in their who they are, their past, their experience. You know, Carney is very much a man of the world of finance, of the global economic elite. Very comfortable on Bay Street, Canada's Wall Street. And Trudeau is a very cut from a very different cloth, of course. Um, so it's striking contrast in who they are, their personalities, how they project themselves, and the question will be whether they run their governments differently as well.
Right, that remains to be seen. In December, Sanjay, there was this polling which happened, the intentional voting polling, and the conservatives and the liberals accounted for about 65% of the votes. But when the elections happened this year, they both sort of got 85% of the votes, so much more than what was what people are planning to vote for them. So what is this, how do you rate this? Is this a blip because they have sort of accounted for such a huge share, and the smaller parties and the New Democrats and others have been sort of really pushed to the margins in a very big way? So is Canada moving towards a two party system? Is it a more permanent change? How do you see this development?
So that's a very big question. It's one that many people are debating right now. I think we'll have to, of course, wait and see. But to try to give a serious answer, I my sense is that this was a critical juncture in Canadian. Well, let me rephrase that. Whether it's a critical juncture in Canadian politics remains to be seen. I think it was an extraordinary election with for very unusual reasons, and the most important, of course, was the return of Donald Trump to the presidency of the United States. His threats to impose tariffs, which he has and now suspended against the Canadian economy. 75% of Canada's exports, if not greater, will go to the United States. Economic prospects of this country are very much tied to the American economy. He also threatened to he also threatened to annex Canada or declare it a 51st state. So this really roiled Canadians across the political spectrum, a sort of an expression of nationalism that I certainly have not seen since the 1990s, when the Quebec separatist referendum took place in the mid 1990s that almost split the country. And so I think it was an extraordinary election, and that explains this remarkable comeback of the Liberal Party. Now winning its fourth election in a row. Uh, it's hard to see how it would have done that absent two things: the arrival of Donald Trump and the fact that Carney replaced Trudeau. He was sort of seen as the right person at the right time to deal with this particular threat. And I think it's also the leader of the opposition, Mr. Poilievre, who's been a lifelong politician since he was 25. It's the only job he's ever held. He was seen as the prime minister in waiting. As they say here, he was measuring the drapes of the official residence to move in, and he lost. And it's interesting to see that conservatives did very well in this election, but polling suggests and some survey research suggests that people were quite turned off by him. He was seen as a rabble rouser. He was seen as a very sort of negative politician who was very good at mobilizing anger and resentment. But would he have the answers to deal with this moment? Would
Was
he
he
live
seen
up?
as Trump light in a way? Or did he remind people of Trump?
Yes, I mean, the Liberal Party tried to paint him that way, and I think for many people it stuck that way. I was struck by how many conservatives I met who said they would never have voted Liberal in their entire lives, but they couldn't vote for Polyev and they wanted to vote for Carney. So I think it's a very particular moment in Canadian political history. I I You asked whether it would become a two-party system. I mean, Canada, of course, like India, has a first past the post electoral system. Its federal party system is not nearly as diverse as India's, of course. As we know, the Indian federal system is the most diverse in the world in terms of its party systems, excuse me, at the subnational level. But Canada has them too. It's very striking that, for instance, in the western provinces, the Liberal Party is not the main opposition usually. It's the Conservatives versus the New Democrats. British Columbia also has its own kind of distinct political configurations. Ontario and Quebec, similarly. Quebec, of course, mostly because of the Quebec nationalists. The Maritime provinces. So I think the language you use in India, where you have multiple party systems that then come together to form a national party system. It's not as distinct, it's not as dynamic as it is in India, but it's something similar. It's more akin to India than the United States, where there really is, of course, only a two-party system. So I think that those differences will persist, and I think a lot will ride on, in some ways, this government. I mean, Carney the New Democrats fared terribly. And in fact, a lot of the vote for the Liberals came from the New Democrats. And that is often the case in first past the post elections. If you fear your opponent, and for New Democrats, the opponent they fear the most uh, tends to be, now I'm going to qualify this in a moment, tends to be the Conservative Party. A lot of those voters shifted to the Liberal Party. So you saw a collapse in the vote for the NDP, the traditional Social Democratic Party of Canada. You also saw voters in Quebec, surprisingly, vote Liberal because they realized, even Quebec nationalists, who said they would never vote Liberal in their lives, but they voted Liberal. And again, the reason was Trump. The threat from the United States was seen as much greater. So even though they may want greater autonomy or even separate or even independence in Canada, some of those hardline Quebec nationalists, they realized that their prospects and fortunes were much more threatened by the United States than Canada. So you
So
saw that
why
happen.
would they imagine or feel that the conservatives would not be as competent when it comes to countering the threat posed by Trump? Because generally, in most countries, if you look at the nationalism quotient, so to speak, of a party, the party which is more towards the right is generally more nationalistic than the party which is toward the center or towards the left. And here,
That's right.
the conservatives, I mean, why did they come through as less qualified to counter the threat of Trump than the liberals?
Yes, that's a good point. And I think it comes back again to Polyev and his strategy. So one is, who do you trust to protect you against what was seen as a foreign threat from your largest neighbor, well, your neighbor and the largest, most powerful country in the world, of which you had good relations for the last 100 years, despite differences over that period. And the other thing was that there was a strategic mistake. The Polyev campaign kept campaigning against Trudeau, and they tried to label Carney as very much a continuation of the Trudeau era, saying that he was carbon tax Carney, for instance. So there was a real the carbon tax in Canada became very unpopular, and this is what Polyev was one of his cudgels against Trudeau, that he imposed this carbon tax, and it was increasing the cost of living and taking the focus off oil and gas sector and expanding it in Canada and so on. And Carney very astutely, although some people would say that okay, it's pragmatism or it's realism that is makes you question where his heart really lies. But his first act on becoming prime minister was to remove the carbon tax, right? To say it won't be imposed. So it robbed the Conservatives of their main campaign plank, and the focus remained on, in a sense, on the Liberals and the continuation of the Liberal Party, as opposed to the threat posed by Trump. And enough more Canadian voters considered the latter to be the bigger threat than the former, right? So the question becomes, I think this is really, it was an extraordinary election. It really focused on leaders, and it focused on four. One, Trump, seen as a menace and a threat. Two, Trudeau, who was deeply unpopular, and many people wanted him to go, including in his own party. Three, Polyev, who, if the Conservatives, he brought a lot of new voters to the Conservative Party, particularly young men, new immigrants, including many from the South Asian community in the Greater Toronto and area, and uh, and also workers. It's really striking that a lot of traditional working class voters, particularly men, in southwestern Ontario, who would have voted traditionally NDP, voted for Conservatives, and so he made a pitch to them, to again focusing on questions of cost of living, the inaccessibility of housing for many because it's so expensive to buy a house, particularly in Vancouver and Toronto. The sense that people's economic fortunes were growing worse rather than better. He capitalized on all of that, and but given who he was, given his persona, given his strategy, people just enough voters saw him as it's just not the right person to be the prime minister. So if you ask the counterfactual, if Trump hadn't been elected, I think we'd see a very different outcome. I think the Conservatives most likely would have formed the government. Whether they would have been a minority or majority was unclear. But it's really the Trump effect and the fact that Carney was the right person. And so there are a number of counterfactuals. Um, if Carney hadn't stepped in, it may have been a different story. Would one of the former uh, would one of the would one of the cabinet ministers under the Trudeau government, and the most senior ones have more or less remained with Carney's cabinet. Chrystia Freeland was the front runner, the former foreign minister, finance minister, deputy prime minister. Could she have defeated Carney? It's not clear. Sorry, could she have defeated Polyev? It's not clear. And I think the bets would have been on that you would have seen a conservative government. So it was really an unusual election where the personas at the top made a massive difference, I think.
Right, right. I mean, thank you for that sort of very detailed sort of analysis. I think, appreciate the point you made about how the conservatives probably lost the ball in terms of their campaign strategy. Focusing too much on Trudeau and continuity, whereas actually, in fact, Carney did represent a break from Trudeau, while eventually ensuring continuity for the Liberal Party. So, where do the Conservatives go from here? I mean, they've been out of power for such a long time now. So, is there a leadership vacuum now there? What is their future looking like
Well,
right now?
the one thing I didn't mention was extraordinary. Pierre Poilievre lost his own seat. That's how unpopular he was in his own riding, which is extraordinary. Um, so he is now running in a by-election in Alberta in a very safe conservative seat, which is voted 70% or more conservative in previous elections. So he's out of the parliament at the moment. He's holding press conferences outside. He's eating a lot of humble pie. People are wanting to see whether that changes his political persona, or at least how he projects himself. Um, at the moment, the Conservatives are, I think, within sort of a holding pattern. I want to see what happens when he comes back. There are questions within the Conservative Party. Proponents of Polyev say he increased its vote share. In any other Canadian election, historically, the Conservative vote share would have led it to form the government. Just in this unusual one, it fell short. He's brought new voters to the party. So people say that that's important to recognize and give him credit for. At the same time, the question becomes, can he then reach more new voters, right? And in particular, this was an election, like in many elections in Western democracies in recent years, where there's a real gender divide. And the divides are kind of similar in Canada, I think, in lots of ways to the United States or Britain or Western Europe. You have a cleavage with just urban-rural. So small town and rural voters tend to vote more conservative than Liberal or certainly NDP. You have a gender divide. So more young men were voting conservative, more women were voting Liberal and NDP. Those are the two major ones. And then, of course, you have an occupational and class divide as well. Although that is a bit more complex, as it is in any other polities as well. So I think the Conservatives, they have 40% or more of the vote in the country at large. So they're in a very strong position. And I think a lot will depend on Polyev. Looks like he, of course, will win this by-election. When he comes back, will he come back as the old leader that he was, or will he try to adopt a new persona that will appeal to enough Canadians to see him as prime ministerial? It's not clear that will happen. And so I think it's the ball's really in Carney's side of the court. How does he govern? What kind of prime minister is he? Can he follow through on these rather extraordinary promises he's made? I mean, the rhetoric is soaring. He says he's going to transform the Canadian economy in a way that hasn't been seen since the Second World War. I mean, those are very lofty aspirations. So can he deliver? Can his government deliver in this time of turmoil for Canada, given that its relationship with the United States is undergoing a massive upheaval?
Right. I mean, I was quite intrigued by his promise to build 500,000 homes a year. I don't know if we have time to sort of dwell on this. Maybe we'll come back to it later. You can comment on that, because that's a huge promise to make. But going back to the divides you referred to just now, Sanjay, you spoke about the rural-urban divide and the gender divide. I was curious about uh, a kind of divide which has been there, which is to do with these provinces like Alberta and Saskatchewan, where there have been sort of how do you put it, separatist kind of tendencies as well. And now these are provinces which have been voting primarily conservative, and now they have a liberal government once again. So, is there a heightened risk of those national unity related crises cropping up now again with this kind of an outcome?
Yeah, there's a real concern. I mean, during the Trudeau era, what's called Western alienation grew against Trudeau. I mean, you can date this back, several decades or many more. Uh, but the dominant perception was that the Trudeau government wasn't taking the concerns of Alberta and particularly its economy seriously. And that's really the debate and the existential question around climate change versus oil and gas. Alberta's economy is really driven by oil and gas, and particularly the oil sands, which is a incredibly uh, polluting form of that kind of production. And for the longest time, politicians in Alberta, particularly on the right, of course, on the conservative side, and other parties on the right, want to expand the production of oil and gas and build pipelines to get it to market. The vast majority of Canadian oil goes to the United States. So the pipelines run south rather than east and west. And so that's what they've been hankering for. The Trudeau government actually bought a pipeline to build the Trans Canada, but pipelines take a very long time to build. And the question becomes, is this something you want to invest in a world in which climate change is accelerating and the risks are catastrophic? So that's the great debate in Canada, like in many other countries, but it's one that's particularly pressing here because we have a particularly dirty form of oil production. But there are a lot of critical minerals as a gas sector. So the debate in Canada has been, we should be expanding production and increasing exports to other countries, new markets, certainly Europe, given its crisis with Russia, maybe East Asia as well. And so that's the debate that's taking place. Carney has said he's going to build pipelines. He's going to expand production. He will have to get the buy-in from the provinces. Provincial jurisdiction is very important. Quebec has traditionally been against building a pipeline that will cross into the Atlantic provinces. Indigenous nations have treaty rights and a veto on those questions. But he has said he wants to streamline those decisions and consultations into a 2-year window with a single office in Ottawa that would handle a lot of this. Whether he can do that remains to be seen. At the same time, he says he wants to make Canada an energy superpower, not simply in the old fossil fuel economy, but also in green energy and clean technologies. Now, whether this government can pull both off remains to be seen. It's a huge ambition. So the aspiration is to increase the production of oil and gas, find new markets, but at the same time to reduce Canada's climate uh, climate change footprint, and it's been struggling. We're far behind our goals for 2030 that the Trudeau government set. We see it in, of course, other Western countries as well. There's a scaling back of ambition exactly at the time when climate change is accelerating. We've just seen reports in the last week that these are this 2024 was the hottest year on record. 2025 to 2029 risks eclipsing the 1.5, even 2 degree increase that all these scientists, of course, are worried about, and we're seeing it happening. And as we speak, there are wildfires taking place in Manitoba, which are so great that they're greater than what would happen in an entire season already in the month of May. So I think this is the existential question for the Canadian uh, for this country when it comes to you want to expand production of oil and gas, expand pipelines because it's central to that economy and to the Canadian economy. At the same time that we have a carbon footprint that has to be reduced, and this country is increasingly vulnerable, certainly to wildfires we've seen in the last few years. And if we look at the historic level of um, Canada's GDP per capita contribution to climate change is one of the highest in the world historically. So how do you meet that aspiration? That's a great challenge. And unfortunately, as we've seen it since Trump has come to power, we've seen a scaling back across the West in many countries of their climate ambitions, of tackling climate change, and
Right.
that's a major question.
Right. I mean, climate adaptation and climate mitigation is, of course, a big challenge for any country, and especially for those countries which large regions like Alberta and Saskatchewan, which are gas and oil dependent. I think the challenge is going to be even more difficult to sort of address. Now, coming to the larger political and international relation challenges, foreign policy challenges for Carney. But ever since he won the election, he's been saying, even before that, during his campaign, he's been saying that the old relationship, quote unquote, with the United States is now over, and there are already talks ongoing between the U.S. and Canada about building a new economic and security partnership. Now, has there been any kind of a vision or a conceptual framework that the liberals have shared publicly about what this new partnership might look like? Because the only kind of relationship with the US that the Canadians know till date is the old one. So, what is this new partnership going to look like? Is it just going to be about having a tariff-free kind of a regime and that's it, or are you going to be more independent in terms of your defense and security requirements and so on and so forth as well?
So that's a huge question. So take it in pieces. The economic relationship, like I said, the Canadian economy is deeply tied to the United States. So the effort, according to Prime Minister Carney, is to diversify its economic relationships, its trade and investment links. And I think they're looking two directions clearly. First is Western Europe. The second would be East Asia. Strong ties historically with South Korea and Japan, but it's
They wouldn't
older.
be looking at China.
China, of course. But China, as you know, has is Canada and China have had very difficult relations for the last few years. So I think going to have a pragmatic approach to China, try to trade in where it's of mutual benefit. But there is, I would say, a sense of caution and concern when it comes to China, of not getting too deeply tied into that. And the whole Indo-Pacific strategy that the Trudeau government unveiled in many ways was to diversify linkages with other countries in the Indo-Pacific in order to reduce Canada's reliance or vulnerability to China. So you look at Indonesia, India, of course, others in Southeast Asia. And I think so that's on the economic side. On the security side, again, we've seen the government immediately talk about trying to enhance cooperation with Western European countries. It's very striking that uh, Carney's first visits were to France and to Britain, and then to the north here in Canada. And that really put emphasis on what he says the three founding peoples of this country, right? The indigenous nations, the British, and the French. So it's really kind of an attempt to think about defense and security and economic relationships in a strategic sense, but also in a symbolic way to sort of think about what makes Canada distinct. And as many of your listeners would know, King Charles was gave the throne speech, which is inaugurating a new parliament just this week. Only the third monarch since 1945 to do so. So again, it was obviously a symbolic moment, but it was meant to distinguish Canada, its constitutional order, its history, vis-a-vis the United States. Now, that all said, the question will be to what extent Canada can really diversify its relationships. To what extent, whether it's defense procurement, whether it's trade and investment, whether it's cooperation on questions of climate change and so on. I mean, we'll have to wait and see. Um, but there's a sense. I think I think I think the thing that's very striking is that the way in which the Trump administration, you know, threatened Canada in the last few months really was a shock to people here, and they just never imagined it, you know. And I think that they put it down to not simply Trump, but of course many in the Republican Party, and so it's a wider systemic change that many Canadians perceive in American politics generally. Um, so
So
the
they don't think that if 4 years later, if Trump goes away and if some other leader or some maybe the Democrats come to power, these
Yeah,
things will go back to normal. They don't think in that fashion. They think it's like a permanent change in the relationship with the US.
that's a sense I get from many Canadians, at least in polls, when you talk to them, you talk to certainly leading figures and pundits. there's a sense in which, yes, Trump, of course, uh, as an actor himself, has caused a lot of damage. And so if he, if he, we say if, I mean, he only has one more term left, but he's already questioning whether he'll follow the Constitution. If Trump leaves the scene, uh, would things return to normal? And I think the feeling here is that it wouldn't, because who's coming in his wake? His vice president is J.D. Vance. There's a MAGA movement. Uh, so they see this as a broader systemic change in the political culture, certainly of the Republican Party, which is clear. It's really been captured by Trump and his politics and his ideology in many ways. And although Trump is a unique figure, there are those who sort of share his beliefs. And I think even during the Biden administration, of course, it was much friendlier to Canada. But if you think about the whole purpose of its revamping of industrial policy to relocate and reshore manufacturing to the United States, there were many in Canada began to wonder, well, what was the implication for that with the sort of very integrated supply chains that Canada and the United States have? Um, and so I think there's a sense in Canada that the United States is changing in some fundamental ways. Trump is both a symptom and an accelerant of those changes. If he leaves the scene, things should be less volatile and less chaotic and less damaging to Canada. But something has shifted, and something has shifted quite dramatically and perhaps permanently in the United States. And so there's a sense of Canada, and essentially was a country that had an exorbitant privilege of being shielded by the United States and protected by the United States for many, many years, many decades. But now suddenly realizes how vulnerable it could be to an administration in the United States that had a different view of Canada. And that sense of vulnerability has been quite shocking, and in a sense existential to many Canadians. So I think there's a feeling that Canada has to strike out and have greater independence from the United States.
Right. I mean that's really interesting to sort of hear from you that there's a general sense that somehow the ground has shifted vis-a-vis United States, and this goes beyond Trump, and it's not just Trump. And that I think is going to have long-term implications on how people think about the relationship with the U.S. and also within Canadian politics as well. Now, one of the interesting developments after the elections was the cabinet reshuffle, Sanjay, and there is a lot of buzz in India about an Indian origin foreign minister in Anita Anand. So just wondering, what are your thoughts on this appointment? I think she replaced Melanie Jolie.
That's
Yeah,
right.
yeah. So what drove this kind of a change? And India Canadian relations have not been great. So do you think this factor would have anything positive to look out for us, or like how do you see this?
Yeah, so Carney immediately becoming, and perhaps even before he became prime minister, but certainly after he became prime minister and before the election, since has talked about the importance of resetting relations with India. So I think that's the first thing to note. The second is that, as you say, Anita Anand is now the foreign minister. Uh, the international trade minister is also of Indian origin, hails from Brampton as an MP. The Secretary of State for International Development is based in Vancouver, but is also from the Punjab. Um, and then you have Ruby Sahota, who's the Secretary of State for Combating Crime. So you have four ministers. I mean, three of them that focus on the international side of things are of Indian origin. So that's quite striking. And I think it's been read by some commentators here to say that's the importance that the Carney government is placing on resetting relations with India. It's also, of course, for the fact that the Indian diaspora uh, is very important as a vote base for the Liberal Party, for all parties in Canada, and particularly in these important ridings in the Greater Vancouver and Toronto area, which is where all of these MPs hail from. So I think that um, those are broader factors to sort of take into account. When it comes to Anita Anand herself, her reputation as someone who's very disciplined, who runs a ministry well. Uh, it's interesting that she's had many portfolios. She only joined politics in 2019 after a career in academia as a professor of law, although she'd held various kind of public-oriented positions before that. Uh, in some ways, it's a question of how long she. I mean, the question I think to ask is how long will she stay in this file? The foreign minister position in Canada, unfortunately, has been a revolving door for a very long time, over a decade. Melanie Joly broke that pattern by being foreign minister for several years, because before that, literally, foreign ministers were changing every 1 or 2 years, and that's an incredibly any minister portfolio. You need time in order to really come to grips with it, understand what's at issue, and so on. But of course, to be the foreign minister is much more important because you're trying to understand the world at large and your country's relations with it. So there's a real hope that she might remain in this position, if only for a sense of stability and continuity. But I think it is very striking that Carney appointed her as the foreign minister. Um, and one way of reading that is the importance of resetting relations with India. Another, of course, was the fact that the foreign ministry in Canada itself is in need of reform. Foreign service officers have for a long time uh, said and demanded that they need more resources, more investment. The diplomatic corps is strained and overstretched, given Canada's ambitions. Uh, Canada's uh, Canada's position in the world has, of course, declined in relative terms as a middle power over the last decade or more. Trudeau famously or infamously announced in 2015 when he came to power that Canada is back. But as we've seen, people see that there's been more slogans and impact in Canadian foreign policy. So there's a big challenge for the foreign ministry. Can it receive the resources it needs in order to have more of an impact? Can it refocus its foreign policy in a way that builds new partnerships with other countries while maintaining its independence? Uh, it's going to have a more prudent, realistic approach, I think, than happened under the Trudeau government. And so I think a lot of commentators believe that Minister Anand might be the right person for that, given her track record. But at the same time, as I've said, she's been in several portfolios within a very short political career. And so we'll have to see how long she stays in that position and what she can do with it.
Right. One last question, Sanjay, before we wrap up. Now, you did mention a couple of times that the Mark Carney administration is very keen to reset relations with India. Now, reset would mean doing certain things, taking certain actions. Now, a couple of issues which have been a source of tension between India and Canada. One, of course, is the feeling that that sections or certain elements which India considers as terrorists, they are getting a free run in Canada under the guise of or under the rubric of human rights and freedom of expression, basically the Khalistani separatist groups in Canada, and that is one. And secondly, also in relation to this issue, India, of course, has asked many Canadian diplomats in India to leave, so their diplomatic strength in India has come down. And so these are issues which are still there. So how, do you think there is going to be a break from the Liberal Party's position on these issues vis-a-vis India from the Carney administration and from the Anita Anand Foreign Ministry, because these are very tough, complicated challenges.
Yes, they are. So I think the investigation into the killing of Mr. Niger is ongoing. We'll have to see where that leads. That's the big elephant in the room in the background, so to speak. Um, Minister Jaishankar and Minister Anand met in the last week, I think virtually as a teleconference. Both reported that they had a productive discussion. I think there's a real sense. I think it was a sense I also read in the Indian press that many in New Delhi felt that relations would be difficult to reset as long as Trudeau was remaining prime minister. So they were waiting for this outcome of this election, whether it was Mr. Poilievre or Mr. Carney. Carney, as I said, has sent many signals that he wants a pragmatic, strong relationship with India. And so I think that's what the focus will be, to think about exploring. They've had a very difficult time for a decade trying to strike a free trade agreement, but India has just struck one with Britain, uh, trying to now do one with the United States. There's a sense that maybe there's an opportunity to make progress on that file, which has bedeviled both countries for a long time. It would be interesting to see whether Prime Minister Modi is invited to the G7 meeting. Canada is leading the G7 meeting. Will take place at the prime ministerial level in just a fortnight. So we'll have to see whether he's coming. He's come to every G7 meeting since 2019. That will be an important sign of where the relationship might be going. Uh, but I think and I think the other issue that will be there is that we haven't talked about it. Housing, healthcare are two big issues in Canada. Immigration was a third. Now, Indian students were the largest body of foreign students in Canada. And under the Trudeau period, particularly post COVID, there was a massive increase in the number of students and temporary workers in Canada as well. That didn't cause the housing crisis. That didn't cause the crisis we're seeing in our healthcare system of backlogs and delays and so on. But it certainly exacerbated them. So there was a cap put on immigration. It's affecting student numbers. The universities have pushed back, saying that it's really affecting their bottom line, and of course, affecting the experience that students would have, our own students here in Canada, of meeting students from elsewhere. But there has been a cap. So that's another question that will be interesting to see. How will the Canadian government handle this? How many students from India will be coming? So I think that's an important, that's a very important piece of the puzzle. We haven't really heard that much about, I have to
Yeah,
admit,
but
since
so
this.
ironically enough, even though Trudeau is widely acknowledged as unpopular, but he was good for Indian students looking to immigrate to Canada, wasn't he?
Well, he was good, but at the same time, the universities had a reason. As you know, foreign students here pay multiples of what domestic students pay in terms of tuition, and that I think was the dark, or not the dark underside, but that was the underbelly of this whole situation. That you know, universities in Canada were relying on foreign students in order to increase revenue, and the reason they had to rely on foreign students increasingly to increase revenue is because there were cuts from the government itself. I mean, it's an astonishing figure. I think maybe once when we've spoken before, Indian students uh, provided more revenue to the colleges and universities of the government of the province of Ontario than the government of Ontario provided to its own universities and colleges. Right? It's an
Right.
extraordinary figure. Now,
Extraordinary.
so it's very important for our universities to have students from India coming. It enriches studies here. Many of them stay. Many go back. Whatever it may be, it's very important for higher education in Canada to have students from India and other countries coming. It enriches the experience here for all of our students and faculty and research and so on. But at the same time, the financial or economic reason why university became very hooked on this was because of lack of funding, sufficient funding, investment from their own governments, provincial and national. So I think this will be something to watch as well. So I think we're in early days. I think my sense is there's a very strong uh, feeling in both New Delhi and Ottawa that there's a real need to reset this relationship. And I think what we're going to see is a number of attempts to have a pragmatic approach to questions, whether it's trade, defense, exploration of critical minerals, could be energy supplies, and so on and so forth. Um, we'll have to wait and see. But
Right.
there, but there,
There can be no doubt. I think both the countries will benefit from a reset in relations. I think there's been a lot of problems and troubles for the people of both the countries following these tensions and the downward sort of tick in diplomatic relations. Let's hope for the best. And that's all I have for you in this episode. Sanjay, thank you so much for coming on In Focus, sharing your, as ever, sharp insights and observations on Canadian politics. Thank you so much. Pleasure talking to you.
thank you.